The story of the Silverhawks is like pulling a dusty book from the library shelf. The show, born in 1986, has gone through so much. Back then, animated stories were more like delivery systems that were particularly designed to sell more and more toys. Perhaps that's why, in every episode of animated shows from that time, they introduced a new toy that was available in the stores near you. But Silverhawks was a little different. It didn't fit into the system. It carried itself differently. It was sharper, stranger, and of course, harder edged. So you gotta wonder what happened to this chrome-plated, gleaming, beautiful show. Why did it simply disappear? So let's turn back time and go back to the 80s. This was a feverish ecosystem where neo-packaging, plastic toys, and televised heroism paid the bills. Children's entertainment quite literally thrived on this one simple formula. You have a world with animated inhabitants who were heroic and colorful and had loads of new gadgets. Then you distributed those animated characters to every home by having dedicated shelves in the toy aisles. He-Man, Transformers, and G.I. Joe. These are popular animated shows from the 80s that were more than just shows. They were storefronts, with stories and tiny theaters of war and fantasy with the sole goal of ending up on birthday wish lists. By 1985, Rankin Bass Productions knew this formula would work with their flagship phenomenon, Thundercats, which quite literally roared across screens with enough force to reshape the toy marketing industry completely. And because of how quickly everything was sold out, and how Thundercats became a household name, they knew they could expand. Success and hunger go hand in hand. It demands spin-offs, echoes, and replicas, so executives looked at Thundercats and wondered, what's next? And the answer was Silverhawks. Silverhawks was quite literally Thundercats, but in space. The elevator pitch was straightforward, right? But the implications of it were not. See, on the outside, this sounded perfect. Science fiction was booming, and cyberpunk's neon-soaked philosophy was slithering into the mainstream through films like Blade Runner. Space westerns, synth-driven action soundtracks, chrome aesthetics, everything was a new stylistic stew that was starting to gain traction and footing in animation. Rankin and Bass saw the trend and decided that this was the right time to create something that gleamed with futurism and danger, but still had archetypal heroics that made Thundercats soar. They created the galaxy of Limbo, a cold place that did not feel like Eternia or Thundera. Every landscape here did not resemble a playground for imagination. This place was colder, it was less inviting, and definitely stranger. It was not something you would expect to attract kids with cereal bowls in their hands. Limbo was all about vastness and crime, and was policed by cyborg enforcers, whose bodies were so enhanced that they were on the brink of dehumanization. Thundercats felt mythic, but Silverhawks, on the other hand, felt more clinical and severe. Honestly, it felt like someone had a skeleton of a police procedural and grafted the spirit of rock opera onto it. The Silverhawks embodied this contradiction completely. They were half human and half metal. They were completely stripped of the softness that usually defined the 80s cartoon protagonists. The main protagonists are Quicksilver, who was once Jonathan Quick, as the team's cool captain, along with Steelheart and Steel Will, the two bionic twins who had cybernetic enhancements and a stoicism that was rare in that era shows, and Captain Stargazer, who's a grizzled veteran who was left behind on Hawkhaven. He was literally the main source of the noir energy you see in this show. He looks like a man entirely sculpted of cigarette smoke and regret. Copper Kid is the mathematical genius of the team, who speaks in whistles and tones. There's something poetic about the way Copper Kid carries himself. Lastly, you have Bluegrass, the cowboy pilot on a guitar-shaped weapon. He's literally an outlier among the outliers. He's a spaceborn Willie Nelson with no cybernetic augmentation at all. His humanity was what anchored the team emotionally. While this is some surface-level characterization, there's more to Silverhawks than just that. The individual arcs of the character subtly explored human psychology under extreme circumstances. For example, Steelheart and Steel Will were not just synchronized warriors. They were mirrors of identity and autonomy while being augmented by technology. Their dialogues always hinted at their silent anxieties about individuality, and the tension that they carried around as their instinct and programming clashed. Similarly, Quicksilver's leadership carried a lonely weight. It was clear that he knew of failure, knowledge, and sacrifice, even in the most carefree moments, like when Stargazer smiles or when Bluegrass plays a riff. You can feel that there's always an undercurrent of existential reflection. The tonal depth of Silverhawks was rarely ever attempted in toy-driven animation at the time. Then, on the other side of the cosmos, you have the villain Monstar. He's a villain, a tyrant made of metal and moonlight. When he transforms, it feels like he's straight out of a metal album cover. His voice, with all the distortion, sounds demonic enough to scare even the bravest children. And then you have his lackeys, Hardware, who has a technopathic mind, Melodia, with her sonic weaponry, and the sycophantic Yes Man, who is this serpentine creature who's straight out of a nightmare. These villains are not just cartoonish, they were nightmarish, and this choice of design was very brave and audacious when you think about their Saturday morning slots. There was a certain amount of danger communicated through the visual spectacle, and this is where Silverhawks began to drift away from the toy and kid-friendly, safe animations that all the contemporaries around them had. The show was not a funny haha animated show, this was serious. There were kidnappings, betrayals, and crimes that didn't feel like antics at all. The stakes were significantly higher, and the action was understandably dangerous, and the violence remained bloodless thanks to the broadcast regulations. You could tell there was an intensity baked into each episode. The universe in which the show was set was one where order was fragile, and justice required invasive self-sacrifice. And even though this show was created to sell more merchandise, it was bleak. You could tell that the ambition was never limited to storytelling. Visually, Silverhawks attempted something that was impossible. Metallic reflection had to be animated frame by frame, and they did it manually. All the artists at Pacific Animation Corporation were given a Herculean task. They had to make the characters look metallic, aerodynamic, and weightless in the void of space. And this kind of animation demands more than just coloring. It needed shading, highlights, and even spectacular effects that traditional animation simply couldn't handle at the time. However, they did it. Every flight sequence doubled the workload, but the animators did it. Every reflective surface took hours to make, but the animators did it. The production pipeline was understandably strained because of this, and animators pushed the deadlines to breaking points, working around the clock with their pencils in hand simply because of their love for the game. Rankin Bass was already stretched this way because of their production of Thundercats, which needed its own teams, its own overseas work, and its own logistical nightmare. So adding another effects-heavy series would mean running 2 marathons at the same time, on a single pair of legs. And these two shows were so vastly different. On one hand, you had Thundercats that could rely on lush backgrounds and mythic landscapes, while Silverhawks needed neon backdrops, star fields, and intricate machinery. Every scene of the show required detail, and Pacific Animation Corporation, working under relentless time pressure, was understandably overwhelmed. Corners had to be cut, and as a result, animations occasionally suffered. Some episodes came out stunning, while other episodes glitched and flickered. The production was struggling to maintain the ambition they had initially set for themselves with such a small budget. There was also a tonal friction present in the writing room. You had network executives who really wanted the toy-driven success and wanted the animators to give fun and accessible storylines. On the other hand, writers wanted a serialized arc that would focus on complex storylines, moral ambiguity, and technological ethics. Both of the groups had valid points, and there was no way to pick one and reject the other. So as a result, every episode oscillated between two extremes. Sometimes it was horror-tinged sci-fi, other times it was lighthearted and toy-focused escapades. Monstar would sometimes inspire dread in one episode, and then he would be the funniest person ever in another episode. As a result, there was always constant clashing between the tonality of the show from episode to episode. Sometimes you would have Bluegrass's solo that was cinematic in every sense of the way, while Steelheart and Steel Will would sound sterile and completely procedural. This kind of tonal whiplash made the show difficult for audiences to latch onto, but it also had a hidden richness in it that eventually rewarded the viewers who rewatched the show years later. Now, here's the thing. Without achieving that kind of harmony, this show was not this good. So, can you imagine what the show would have been like had it achieved perfect harmony? It would have been something unexpected, right? But there was another problem. Merchandising was already tanking. You see, in the 1980s, toys were everything. It was literally the heartbeat that kept the studios alive. But Kenner's Silverhawk figurines, even though they were striking and beautiful, had a fatal flaw. They were metallic. They had a reflective coating on them, which is definitely great to look at, but when you played with the toy on a daily basis, it would be chipped, scratched, and flaked within the first few hours. As a result, the parents were not happy with the purchase, and the kids started losing interest really quickly. The tactile fantasy that Kenner tried to sell so that the show would still be running was already failing. Without strong toy sales, the financial justification for another season didn't make sense at all. But despite all of the economic and logistical limitations, Silverhawks had carved out a visual and thematic niche for itself that honestly could have altered the trajectory of 80s animation as a whole. What Silverhawks possessed was far more than the shiny armor or the retro-futuristic ambition. It was like this strange kind of defiance, something they held on to that insisted they wanted to be something in the marketplace that would set them apart from everyone else. However, with a desire like that comes the reality of the world not being ready for it. But the demise of the show was inevitable, and it was not immediate. If a show flops with a spectacular thud, then it gets buried under its own confusion. However, Silverhawks wasn't like that. It was suspended in a cultural half-life. It never fully connected with the intended audience, but it never truly disappeared either. It became the cartoon equivalent of an artifact that you just don't know how to categorize. It was too ambitious and could not fit into a shelf with every other show from that time. After its its initial burst of episodes, the series simply hovered. It was just like one of its own characters caught between organic identity and mechanized existence, not knowing which part to lean into. Once the show wrapped production, the studio had a strange collection of leftovers, toy prototypes that never made it past early concept drawings, plus scripts of episodes that would never be produced, and of course, half-developed villain characters waiting to be given form. These were memos about the potential start of a second season. Hints of guest characters were even drawn up to keep the universe expanding. However, these were just remnants in a vacuum. They were simply signs of a world that could have been if everything had cooperated. Inside Rankin Bass, there were conversations around Silverhawks, and those conversations had turned philosophical. Some creators believed that the show was failing because it leaned more into the soap opera aspect, instead of being child-friendly with the grounded emotional hooks that would drag everyone in. However, others genuinely believed that the story was not at all critical. The show was simply created for the sake of marketing. Given how detail-oriented the toys were, they were expensive to manufacture, and so, as you can guess, they cost more on the shelves. The parents didn't want to spend that amount of money on a toy that would ship, get scratches and everything, so the toy line that was supposed to support the show became the very financial anchor that was dragging it down. In the meantime, competitors were flooding the market with new lines of toys every month, and Silverhawks started struggling to stay visible. For a franchise that was meant to shine, the Silverhawks ended up struggling a lot. Behind the scenes, the animation team had nothing left to do but watch this fall out with mixed feelings. They put in a lot of effort for the visual identity of the series, and the result was a world unlike anything else that was on air at the time. This was an intentional choice that they made. The studio had actually pushed the Japanese animation team to create this sense of sleek movement that you'll find everywhere. The ship streaked across nebulae with a grace that felt almost too fluid for television, but it didn't happen by chance. Everything from lighting, shading, and metallic sheen on the characters was intentional. They did everything that a general Saturday morning cartoon would never dare to do, but the audience who would have appreciated these details were not there at all or were too young for these kind of details. And so you can't forget that back then, the network shuffled time slots around a lot, so it makes total sense that the show's momentum kinda just got strangled out. The merchandising section also felt the same way. They weren't very happy with how the toys they created barely made it to the stores before being pulled back. Some figures only made it to the test markets and eventually became rare collector's items, but that happened decades later. The playsets that they designed and the toys that they created never reached the target audience, i.e. the kids, because the retailers hesitated a lot and the distribution of the merchandise was limited. The entire line became a victim of the very science fiction qualities that made it unique in the first place. It was futuristic in a way that demanded attention, but did not demand to be bought, if that makes sense, and the gap just kept widening between them. There was no denying that the cancellation was creeping closer. Rankin Bass tried to salvage the universe one last time. The writer sketched out an outline for a longer-form story arc, a story where Monstar was going to go from an episodic villain to a cosmic threat with mythology behind him. They wanted to explore the origins of the transformation chamber and dive deep into how Limbo came to exist at this place, where laws do not exist. The characters who barely had screen time were going to have full-on backstories, motivations, and the whole 9 yards. But in the end, very few of those concepts survived, and that too, only through interview recollections. If the second season had actually come out, it would have completely altered the show's tone. The stakes were going to rise, and this time, the Hawks would have to face more than external conflicts. They would have to face internal conflicts too. The hardware upgrades were another aspect that was going to come into play in this season, which undoubtedly would have helped the toy line. There were notes about the faction of rogue Hawks that were corrupted prototypes of our beloved heroes, built on dark cybernetics. The studio even considered creating organic first agents who had rejected the metal enhancements completely, hence introducing an ideological opposition into the show. There were ideas, very good ones might I add, everywhere. However, there were not enough green lights. What did survive were the fans, the persistent, oddly passionate and niche group of viewers who clung to Silverhawks even after the show ended and the toy aisle stopped carrying the figures. The show's reruns enjoyed modest success abroad, particularly in regions that aired the episodes at better time slots, or with cartoons that complemented them instead of overshadowing them. This created a quiet international afterlife that prevented the show from completely fading away. Bootleg tapes eventually emerged, and they were circulated in the 90s, and fans recognized the show as a piece of 80s animation that did not quite fit into the cultural center, but was not completely obscure either. Silverhawks literally trod the edge, dancing on it and refusing to be forgotten. By the time the late 90s rolled around, Silverhawks found itself rediscovered by the collectors who were surprised by the quirks that happened behind the scenes. The shiny metal figures, which were one of a kind, became a retro-futuristic novelty. The toy magazines actually ran articles calling the toys lost gems. There was a strange blend of space western and metallic science fantasy that suddenly felt ahead of its time. Nostalgia breathed new life into the brand. Kids who barely remembered the show rediscovered the show as adults and realized how much thought, effort, and ambition was put behind it. Eventually, DVDs DVDs became popular, and that became the dominant nostalgia format. The episodes were cleaned up, packaged, and reintroduced to the public. This renewed clarity brought out the show's visual experimentation that VHS tapes could not show clearly. The people noticed that the animation of Silverhawks had this texture. There was a deliberate use of eerie color schemes, and there were reflective surfaces used in storytelling. The fans and critics who dismissed the show realized that even though the series had some issues in delivering a compelling character arc, it did build a world that was substantial and distinct. However, despite that realization, Silverhawks never became mainstream. It remained in a place where the franchise never returns, but never truly dies. Other properties from that era got revived and reimagined, and merchandise cycling went on for decades. Silverhawks didn't get anything like that. It was one of those that people whispered about when they would discuss overlooked gems. They would bring the show up whenever they were making lists of cartoons that deserved a second chance. But there was no revival. There were always rights complications, corporate mergers, and of course, a shifting media landscape that did not sustain the series. So it simply remained dormant. Every time someone talked about a reboot, there were people talking about negotiations that would stall it out. There were rumors that came up periodically, but nothing ever materialized. While the fans kept the series alive by revisiting it, the creators of the show had moved on. Rankin Bass eventually closed its doors and sealed the Silverhawks universe behind metaphorical glass. Some of the animators who worked on the show moved into other corners of the industry, bringing their stylistic sensibilities with them. If you compare their later work with the Silverhawks, you would see the aesthetic. There was a continuation of the visual language that the animators started in Silverhawks. Collectors still kept the torch burning though. The toy figures gained a mythic status among certain circles because of their chrome coatings and how perfectly made they were. The characters had weight to them. You could sense that those toys wanted to be taken seriously, but the market clearly could not decide what to do with them. Because of the scarcity of the figures, there was a chase factor to it. The myth of Silverhawks grew from the whispers and tales of the collectors, who told stories about how they got the rarest of the pieces. The myth of Silverhawks grew for the same reasons that the show itself did not. And then we were introduced to the age of streaming. Something interesting happened as we entered that era. People who had never seen the show before got access to it in its most crisp digital version. New viewers discovered the series through curiosity alone, and they found a universe that was deeply committed to its own identity. Even the viewers who felt that the episodes had an antiquated pacing could appreciate the talent and time that were put behind the animation they were seeing on screen. The characters resonated more with the audience, where the blur between identity and technology feels a bit more relevant now. As a result, we get a strange conclusion for Silverhawks. It was a show that aimed too high when it was released. It tried to operate on a different wavelength from its contemporaries, and it failed. But it did so in a decade where the market was more unforgiving to niche and other animations. Silverhawks was supposed to be a series that would sell toys instantly and communicate its entire glance in 1 second. But Silverhawks wasn't that. It was a space western, and it was not going to have the same vibes. The show required patience, and the market didn't care about that. But despite all of it, Silverhawks continues to surface. It refused to fold or be forgotten. It stood apart. And even to this day, because of those risks that the show took, it's what keeps it relevant. And here's the best part. The further we move away from the 80s, the more and more relevant Silverhawks feels to us. It feels like a show that, while it came out in the 80s, didn't belong in that decade at all. It was a fragment of a possible future that somehow ended up in the past. It was a vision that the market couldn't handle. Marvelous verdict. The story of Silverhawks is not just about a sci-fi cartoon that didn't survive the 80s. It's about how some creations live longer than anyone expected, because they touch a part of our souls, even if that happens decades later. The show tried to be a shining beacon in a crowded sky, and while it didn't end up as that, it became a star that will always be present. You just need to look for it. For a franchise that's built upon the idea that heroes are forged from metal and vision, this kind of survival feels extremely fitting. Silverhawks may have never soared the way everyone thought they would, but I wouldn't say that they crashed either. They're simply gliding around, still refusing to corrode. With that, we come to the end of our video. Let us know what you guys think about the video in the comments down below. I'll see you guys next time.